Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're gonna make a machete. Today we're back out at the farm, and to clear some space on the farm, I need a machete. I decided to make that machete, and that includes two big things that I really know nothing about: knife making and blacksmithing. So today, we're gonna start learning how to do both of those things. It should be pretty obvious, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. I don't know what I'm doing. Don't take anything this video as the correct way to do it. But instead, check out some of the other awesome videos here on YouTube from blacksmiths and knife makers with the correct details. Also, I found these two books that I'm currently going through, and they've got a ton of great information in them. I'll link these down in the description in case you want to check them out. Before we get started though, I want to walk you through the setup that I'm using and show some of the reasons why it's maybe not ideal or things that are going to need to be upgraded in the future. The first thing is the forge. A few weeks back, you may remember that I actually made this forge in a video, and it does technically work, but honestly, it doesn't really get as hot as I would like, and it's kind of short for making a machete. So I went onto eBay, and I found this little forge. So I'm gonna hook this thing up and get it going for the first time, but I've got some friends like David Picciuto and Jimmy Diresta who have the same one, and they've had great results. Now let's move on to the anvil. I have this awesome anvil that I got that is too low. I don't have a stand tall enough yet to have it at the right height. So for now, it's gonna be a little bit low, and it's also not tied down to the stand. Eventually you wanna have that tied down so it doesn't bounce around. I'll get to that when I build the new stand. I've got a hammer, which is a 3-pound hammer, not ideal, but again, it's what I've got on hand until I get a better one. And for the steel, I've got a piece of 3/16 high carbon steel that I'm gonna use for the knife. This will give the back of the blade a nice thick edge, so it's really strong, and we can start to hammer this down into the blade. All right, let's fire this thing up and get this hot. While that's heating up, let me show you some of the ideas in my notebook of the shapes that I'm going for. There's a bunch of different shapes of machetes. I've got two sketched out here that I kind of like. This one has more of a curved back and then really gentle curves on the bottom. I've got kind of the curves marked out here outside the shape so I know where I want to put the stress and where I want to beat on the metal. This is another option down here with a straighter front and just a straight back. I think I'm going to go with this one. This is more traditional, but there's a bunch of different shapes and they're all called machetes. Just to give you an idea of what I'm doing here, I've got a little mark that's gonna tell me where the tang or the handle is gonna be down here. And then I added a little curve at the top to draw down the tip of the knife, and now I'm trying to thin out the cutting edge and kind of pull that down. That's gonna completely change the end of this. I'll have to deal with that later on. But also, I'm doing my best to keep it straight. I'm not doing a great job yet, but I need to make sure that I'm keeping it as flat as I can between each one of the heats. Another thing I've read about knife making is that at any point you want to, you can switch from forging to stock removal. You can head to the grinder to start to shape out the curves and smooth out the surfaces. So I'm really just doing this part for the experience of it, and at some point when I think I'm not really making any more progress, I'll switch over to the grinder. I found that as I'm trying to get the blade flattened out, the blade side of it flattened out, it's causing a big curve on the back side, the side that needs to be straight. So for the next couple of heats, I'm going to try to take it out and try to get the back straight by laying it upright on the anvil and just trying to flatten it. Now that's going to mess up my cutting edge, but I still have a long way to go there anyway, so it's fine. here we are, after maybe, I don't know, 45 minutes of forging. I've got the shape of the handle down here kind of at the angle that I wanted. The blade doesn't exactly have the shape that I wanted, but you know, it's progress. I did learn on the tip here that you need to bring the top corner down a lot more than I did, because it basically disappears once you start flaring out the front bottom of the blade, the cutting edge. So let me show you what I've got here next to what we started with. These were the exact same piece of steel. You can now see that this one's a little bit longer, not a whole lot longer. You can also see that it's a little bit wider, not a whole lot wider. But the big thing is that I didn't want to touch this back edge. I wanted it to stay thick and strong so that it will be the strength of the entire blade. And I was trying to work down the cutting edge. I didn't do great, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the hammer I had kind of an edge. It should be a rounded hammer. I think that would give a better result here. So the next step here is to do the heat treating on this. I'm gonna let all this stuff cool down, take it home so I can work on it there, and then I'm gonna go through the heat treating steps and then anneal it. Now I'm not gonna describe all that for you because it's new to me, honestly, but there is the book that I showed you earlier that has a great description of the entire process. We're back here at the house. I wanted to show you the progress on this and explain a little bit about what I did off camera. I did 3 normalizing cycles, and that's where you heat the metal up to a certain point where it's not magnetic. Then you let it air cool back down to its regular temperature. You do that 3 times in a row, and that realigns the grain of the steel and makes it hard again. Now I also annealed it, which means I heated it up again, but I let it cool down really slowly, and I used the vermiculite, the stuff that you saw me pull this out of. Again, I don't have all the details in that process, but I wanted to kind of fill you in as to how we got where we are right now. This thing should be soft enough to work on a grinder, so next I'm going to work on cleaning off this cutting edge and starting to get it into shape. Using the angle grinder, I started to clean off this edge just so I could see it. It looks really cool, and I think I'm going to leave in some of the forge marks and just work on cleaning up the actual cutting edge. But first, I need to move to the belt grinder and actually get this profile. This needs to be a continuous straight line. This needs to be cleaned up a lot. I need to fix the tip and all that before I actually get to making the edge. So I'm going to do that. There's not a whole lot to say about it, so montage time. And this is where we're at. I'm extremely excited about how well this is turning out. I really actually kind of like the forge marks that are on the side of this. I'm going to leave them there. But to try to get some sort of a bevel was actually a lot easier than I thought. And I think that's because I did my best to try to keep this thing straight. And it's not perfectly straight. There's actually a curve in it that you can see when you look down the blade. But it's in good enough shape that I could get kind of a consistent bevel across all of the entire cutting edge. So I've only got it up to about a 600 grit. I honestly don't know how high I should take it, but this is a machete. It's not meant to be a super fine blade. It's more for like chopping stuff down. So we're gonna probably stop there with trying to get the cutting edge in shape and do the rest of that later on. But for now, I wanna try to clean up the top, add a little bevel on these sides just to give it a detail, to do something else, because honestly, I'm just having fun. After I added that top edge, I think I'm pretty much done with the overall shape of this thing. The next step in this is to harden the steel. But before I do that, I also need to drill some holes so that I can put in some pins for the handle later on. For that, I found this piece of stainless steel. I actually pulled this out of a 3D printer. And so I'm gonna use this to go through the handle to be the pins to lock the whole thing together. That means I need to drill a matching hole in 2 places on this. So I'm just gonna do that, and then I'll walk you through the hardening process. Now that I've got those holes drilled, the next thing is to harden the blade. So we're gonna heat it up really, really hot and then cool it off very quickly. That's gonna make it super hard, but also very brittle, so we'll have to handle that down the road. But to do this, I'm gonna make a quench tank. Now, this is all stuff that you need to research on your own if you're gonna do it, but just to give you a brief overview, I'm gonna glue this cap onto the end of this, fill it up with oil. People use different things for quenching. You heat up the steel really, really hot, and then you completely submerge it in the oil, and that will make it cool off very, very quickly. So I'm gonna glue this thing up, tie it to this I-beam so it will stay in place, and then we'll go do that. Now that we've got this thing in the fire, we're gonna let it heat up, and then we'll do the quench. Now there's some safety stuff here that I wanna point out. You need to do your own research on this, but there is a possibility for a couple of things to go wrong. One, when we do the quench, the blade could bend, and that's not really a big deal. The bigger problem is a potential fire. We are dipping this in oil, which is flammable, so we want to make sure to dip it all the way down past the surface so the entire thing is under the oil. If there is any sort of a fire on the top surface, we've got a cover that we can put on the pipe to cut off the oxygen supply. We've also got a fire extinguisher. I'm going to be wearing gloves and a face mask. Just be super careful if you do this. Make sure to do your full due diligence on safety and on research. That actually went surprisingly well, and I'm pretty happy with it. Now at this point, the steel is really brittle. If you were to drop it on the concrete, it may shatter, which is pretty wild. So the next step to fix that is tempering. And you do that by raising the metal up to about 400 degrees. You can do it in a normal oven, and you do that a couple of times, and that gets it ready to do the final shaping on the cutting edge and to kind of finish up the blade. So I'm gonna do that, and then I'll show you the blade when it's all done. I got the knife in my powder coating oven at 400 degrees. This is essentially just a toaster oven. You could use that as well. You could use the oven in your kitchen. Just be sure to clean the blade before you put it in there like I did. You could also just use a fire pit as long as you can keep that fire pit at a high enough temperature and a consistent enough temperature for a couple hours. I've got the knife out of the oven and went through 2 tempering cycles, and this is it. You can see that it has some kind of blue and purple coloring, and that actually tells you the temperature that it was tempered at. There's some charts online that will show you all the range and all the temperatures that go with the colors. It's pretty fascinating, actually. I went ahead and took this to the grinder and cleaned up the other side, and this is where we're at. So I still have a lot of work to do to kind of clean up this edge down here and then flip it over and do the other side. So we're gonna head back to the grinder just a little bit, get that cleaned up, and then we'll move on to the handle. I wanted to point out one thing about this belt grinder. Originally, I had a really cheap one that I got in an estate sale, and I upgraded to this recently, but the cheap ones, the small ones, will totally work for this. The big advantage of having a bigger one is that the belt is longer and has more time to go around before it gets back to the material, which allows it to cool down and not overheat your metal. That will mess up your temper. So if you have a smaller one or even an angle grinder, it will totally work, but you have to take your time so that you don't overheat the piece you're working on. This is where we're at on the blade. It's looking pretty good, and I think I'm gonna stop there for now before I get to the final sharpening. Next up, we're gonna work on the handle. And if you've ever seen anybody on YouTube make a knife handle, it's basically the same process. I've got some extra teak scraps that I'm gonna use for this, just because I really like the way it looks. So we're gonna trace this out, cut it down, cut it in half, put the 2 pieces on each side of the handle, and then put that pin through it that I showed you early on, and then glue it all together. Got a little ahead of myself and went ahead and cut these in half before drilling the holes, but you have to drill a hole through both pieces so that they line up with the holes in the middle of the tang of the knife. The epoxy is all set up, so now we're gonna go shape this handle down. I'll do a little bit of sharpening off camera. We'll add some oil to the handle, and then we can try it out. Here it is, all finished up. The last thing is to go out to the farm and try it out. I'm just kidding. We're being dramatic just to be funny. We do need to go find some stuff to cut to try this thing out. One of the reasons I chose to do a machete for my first knife was that it doesn't have to be a precision instrument. It's a blunt force knife for sure, which is a great way to get started. Now, unfortunately, this thing is pretty bowed. It's not straight, the edge is not perfect, but it totally does its job. Also, unfortunately, it's wintertime, which means there's nothing green out here, and the only thing worth chopping down are trees, and I don't want to do that, so I only got to test it a little bit. I am really happy with this though, and it's a great entry into knife making and into blacksmithing. If it gave you some inspiration or ideas, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. Also, we've got tons of other types of projects that you may be interested in. Be sure to check those out, and if you're not subscribed, do that as well. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. We're back here at the house. I upgraded to a really nice one not too long ago because I knew I would be doing more. Be doing. Boink, boink, boink. The last thing is to go out to the farm and try it out.